These quiet types never last when the real blood starts flowing. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 96 minutes before Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rivera arrived dying on a gurney with a bullet next to his heart. St. Michael's Trauma Bay in Atlanta smells like antiseptic and cold steel under flickering fluorescent lights at 2 a.m. Sarah Chen moves through the night shift with practiced invisibility, her scrubs crisp, her hand steady as she preps for lines and checks monitors. The other nurses notice small things without quite understanding them: how she never flinches at arterial spray, how her suture technique looks almost surgical, how she sometimes touches the tarnished challenge coin she keeps in her locker before each shift, holding it for exactly 3 seconds before the shift begins. A faint scar runs along her left forearm, barely visible unless you're looking, the kind of scar that tells a story nobody asked her to explain. The scar came from a piece of helicopter rotor blade at 4 a.m. on March 17, 2013, in a place that no longer appears on any official map. 16 people died that morning. The Navy erased 23 years of her service record, sealed her file with a classification stamp marked Eyes Only, issued her a new Social Security number, and ordered her to disappear into civilian life. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen ceased to exist. A nurse named Sarah Chen began to exist instead, starting paperwork at a community college in 2023, no prior employment history, no references that could be verified, no family listed on her emergency contact form. The challenge coin stayed with her, tarnished silver from a unit that officially never existed, embedded with shrapnel from a burning vehicle in Kandahar province. She kept it in her locker next to her spare shoes. When Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrives as the new trauma director 3 months into her tenure, he spots Sarah immediately during morning rounds. She's standing alone at the medication station, double-checking a patient's dosage against the electronic chart. She doesn't look up when he enters. She's too composed. Too quiet. Everything about her reads as someone who shouldn't be here, no nervous energy, no junior nurse fidgeting, no need to fill the silence with gossip or commentary like the other staff members clustering by the break room door. The shift briefing happens at 6:51 a.m., and Whitfield announces his position by announcing his judgment. His voice carries across the conference room like someone used to being the loudest person in any space. "I'm betting 2 weeks' salary," he says, looking directly at Sarah while the other 14 staff members fall quiet, "that the quiet one doesn't make it 7 days. These quiet types never last when the real blood starts flowing. They fold. They crack. They go home and cry into their pillows." He smiles. The other nurses laugh nervously, uncertain whether this is hazing or medical wisdom. Sarah's jaw clenches once. A single muscle contraction beneath her skin, visible for maybe half a second. Then her face goes completely neutral. Her hands remain steady as she turns back to her patient charts, writing vitals in her precise, careful handwriting. She does not look at Whitfield. She does not respond. She does not give him anything, not anger, not tears, not the smallest acknowledgement that he has said anything worth hearing. This makes Whitfield's smile sharper. What Whitfield does not know is that Sarah has survived things that would make his measured insult sound like compliments. She has held a tourniquet on her own leg for 43 minutes while waiting for extraction. She has watched 16 of her closest friends die in a burning vehicle because the intelligence was wrong. She has spent 3 years in a psychiatric evaluation by the Pentagon to determine whether she was still mentally fit for duty, only to be told that the answer no longer mattered because her duty was classified and buried. She has learned to make herself invisible because visible people ask questions, and the only answers she has are all marked secret. The tarnished coin in her locker becomes a ritual. Before every shift, she holds it for 3 seconds and remembers what happened and what was ordered never to be mentioned. Then she puts on her scrubs and becomes someone else entirely. The night shift proceeds normally until 1:08 a.m. Sarah is in Trauma Bay 3, suturing a laceration on a construction worker who'd slipped on a metal edge, when dispatch radios through an incoming GSW, gunshot wound, single entry to the chest, unconscious, ETA 7 minutes. The trauma team jumps into the familiar choreography of preparation. Surgical lights are checked and angled. The defibrillator pads are positioned on the flat metal surface. Suction apparatus is tested with a soft hiss of air. For poles are positioned at precise angles. The OR nurses pull up the emergency blood bank requisition, and the attending surgeon, not Whitfield, thank the protocols, is being called in from home. Sarah's hands move through these preparations with the muscle memory of someone who has done this 10,000 times. Not as a nurse. As something older. Something that did not need a license or paperwork to justify its existence. The ambulance arrives at 1:54 a.m., and the paramedics wheel the stretcher in with the kind of controlled urgency that comes only from professional experience. Sarah hears the attending paramedic speak before she sees the patient. Male, approximately 54, single GSW to the right thorax, entrance wound approximately 2 centimeters left of the sternum, unconscious on scene, BP was 88/60 in the field, sat dropping, we gave him high flow O2, placed a left radial arterial line for pressure monitoring, running normal saline wide open. The stretcher rounds the corner into trauma bay 2, and Sarah moves to assist with the transfer. The paramedic pulls the patient's identification card from the wristband. She sees the name. She sees the rank. She sees the unit designation. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rivera. 5th Battalion, 3rd Marines. Her son David's commanding officer. Sarah's hands do not shake. Her breathing does not change. Her face remains a neutral mask as she helps slide the patient from the stretcher onto the trauma table, his unconscious body still wearing the blood-stained uniform of someone who was still in operation somewhere she is not allowed to know about. David had mentioned Rivera twice in his letters home from Kandahar. Once to say that Rivera had commended his tactical analysis. Once to say that Rivera had personally recommended David for advanced sniper certification. Letters that came home with sections redacted in black marker, classified segments surgically removed by hands that belonged to the same institution that had erased Sarah's own records. The attending surgeon, Dr. Patricia Hansen, competent and calm, begins her assessment. Entrance wound right anterior chest wall, she narrates, examining the area around the bullet hole, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision. 2 centimeters lateral to the left sternal border. Approximately at the level of the 4th intercostal space. That puts us potentially at cardiac, potentially at thoracic great vessels. Sarah moves to the patient's left side, positioning the monitor leads with her steady hands. She does not look at the patient's face. She looks at the monitor. The rhythm scrolling across the screen is erratic, ventricular ectopy, irregular beats, the electrical signature of a heart that is struggling. The blood pressure reads 82/55. Dropping. We need X-ray, someone says. The portable radiograph machine is wheeled in by the imaging tech, and everyone backs away from the table as the machine positions over the patient's chest. The radiation clicks silently, and within 90 seconds, a digital image appears on the display monitor. Sarah watches Dr. Hansen's jaw tighten slightly as she reviews the image. Pneumothorax, Hansen says quietly. Small. More concerning is she pauses. Points to the cardiac silhouette. See that widening of the mediastinum? And the heart is sitting low. That's fluid. He's got cardiac tamponade. The bullet nicked the pericardium, and blood is filling the sac around his heart. We need to decompress that now or we're going to lose him. The attending surgeon's hands move toward the equipment. She is competent. She is trained. But Sarah has already calculated the time and the angle, has already visualized the needle's trajectory, has already run the procedure through her muscle memory 16 times in the 4 seconds it took Hansen to make the diagnosis. This is the moment where Sarah steps forward or stays silent. This is the moment where a nurse named Sarah Chen follows orders, and a Master Chief Petty Officer named Chen recognizes a life that needs saving and a procedure that she can perform in her sleep. The room went very quiet. The monitor beeped steadily, the rhythm getting more erratic, the blood pressure dropping with each passing second. 78/52. The patient is dying. They have minutes. Maybe less. Sarah reaches for the cardiac needle. Her voice, when she speaks, is low and steady and carries the kind of weight that does not require volume to be heard. I need a 14-gauge needle. Sterile field prepped at the fourth intercostal space, left midclavicular line. The room does not move. Dr. Hansen looks at her. The other nurses look at her. The tech holding the suction cannula looks at her. Now, Sarah says. It is not a request. It is not a question. It is a command issued by someone who has given commands before, in places where commands were followed immediately or people died. The equipment appears in her hands. The tarnished coin in her distant locker stays hidden. The scarred forearm, visible now because her sleeves are pushed up, tells no stories to anyone in this room. And as Sarah positions herself at the patient's bedside, her shoulders straighten, her breathing becomes controlled and precise, and something that had been dormant for 3 years begins to wake. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The monitor beeped. The patient's blood pressure continued to drop. And Sarah Chen, who was supposed to be invisible, who was supposed to be quiet, who was supposed to be the kind of person who broke under pressure, moved like someone who had been trained by the United States Navy to save lives in conditions that would destroy ordinary people. The moment Dr. Whitfield's voice cut through the nurse's station on Tuesday morning, Sarah knew this was deliberate. She was entering vitals into the computer, fingers steady on the keyboard, when he positioned himself directly in her line of sight with 4 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. His voice dropped into that register he used for teaching moments, the kind designed to carry through an entire hallway. Chen, right? He didn't wait for an answer. Or should I call you Mouse? You haven't said 10 words since I arrived. Sarah continued typing. BP 120/82. Heart rate 86. Oxygen saturation 98%. The cursor blinked. Her jaw remained unlocked, her breathing unchanged. In the background, she heard one of the residents shift their weight, uncomfortable with the silence. Mouse it is then, Whitfield announced, turning to face his audience. Let's see if Mouse can handle real trauma. She pressed enter. The data saved. Sarah turned to the next patient's chart without acknowledging him, and Whitfield's eyes narrowed, that micro-expression of a man unused to being ignored. He lingered for exactly 3 seconds longer than he needed to, waiting for something. Flinching. Breaking. An apology. Sarah simply moved to the next monitor, and Whitfield eventually walked away, his residents following like a school of fish that had suddenly lost interest in the current. What he didn't understand was that Sarah Chen had spent 18 months in a forward operating base where silence was survival. She had learned to breathe through insults the same way she'd learned to breathe through mortar fire, mechanically, with no wasted motion. His words were noise. Background hum. Wednesday brought the cafeteria. Sarah carried her lunch tray past Whitfield's table, the one positioned near the windows where the board members liked to sit, where conversations were loud enough to be heard throughout the room. She wasn't trying to pass by him. The cafeteria had only 3 routes to the seating area, and she'd chosen the one that seemed clearest. Whitfield's foot extended into her path with the casual precision of a man testing a hypothesis. The tray crashed to the floor. The sound was specific, the wet splatter of minestrone soup hitting tile, the metallic clang of silverware scattered like shrapnel, the ceramic bowl shattering against the edge of a chair. The entire cafeteria turned. 73 people, Sarah estimated, watching the soup pool across the floor in expanding circles. Careful, Mouse, Whitfield said, his fork still raised to his mouth, his eyes fixed on the board members beside him as though he was commenting on weather. We can't have clumsy nurses in trauma. One of the other nurses stood immediately, moving toward her with a roll of paper towels. Sarah shook her head once, a single, sharp gesture. Not a request. The nurse froze, then sat back down. Sarah knelt on the tile, her knees in the spreading soup, and began retrieving the scattered silverware. Each piece was placed deliberately on the tray. The broken ceramic bowl went next, then the napkin, then the spill itself, methodical as a forensics team collecting evidence. Her face showed nothing. Her hands didn't tremor. Her breathing didn't hitch. But her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle along her cheekbone became visible, a single tell in an otherwise perfect performance. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then it released. She stood, tray in hand, and walked to the trash bin without meeting anyone's eyes. In her peripheral vision, she could see Whitfield watching her, could feel the weight of his attention like a physical force. He'd been expecting her to cry. Expecting her to apologize. Expecting her to quit. Instead, she returned to the serving line and placed another bowl of soup on a clean tray. Thursday was the worst. It happened during evening rounds, when the ER was full but not yet chaotic, enough witnesses without enough noise to cover what was happening. Sarah was reviewing a patient's chart, adding notes about medication interactions and response times. Her handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the discipline of someone who'd learned that details saved lives. Whitfield approached from her left, moving faster than necessary, and tore the chart from her hands. He dropped it. But that wasn't quite accurate. He threw it, a gesture that looked careless to everyone watching, a dropped chart, an accident, until you noticed the angle of his wrist, the deliberate snap that scattered the pages across the ER floor in a constellation of scattered data. Patient history, lab results, medication lists, vital signs, all spreading outward like debris from an explosion. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with condescension, the kind of voice someone used when talking to children or animals. "And next time, I want legible notes. Not whatever chicken scratch you call documentation." Sarah knelt immediately, her movements economical. 1 page at a time, collected methodically, ordered by date and category. Around her, the other nurses had gone very still. A nursing student started to help, but Sarah held up one hand, just her palm, visible but not aggressive, and the student understood. This was Sarah's moment. She would own it or she would break. She did neither. Each page was retrieved with the same precision she'd used to load magazines in a desert training facility. Patient labs from Tuesday. Medication notes from Wednesday. The progress note she'd written at 0300 hours when Rivera was just another unconscious trauma patient and not yet the man whose son had written her letters about missing his commanding officer's stories. Her jaw clenched again, that slight visible tension, and then released. She stood with a gathered chart, walked to the nearest desk, and began reorganizing it in perfect order. Whitfield watched from across the ER. He didn't leave. He stood there for nearly 30 seconds, his eyes locked on her bent head, his expression shifting from contempt to confusion. The mockery had no traction here. The insults weren't landing. Sarah Chen wasn't flinching. She wasn't crying. She wasn't quitting. She was simply returning to work. In the supply closet 3 minutes later, alone, Sarah's hands finally found their limit. She gripped the metal shelf so hard the paint cracked under her fingernails. The tremor started in her forearms and radiated upward, not fear but something close to it, the physical manifestation of 18 months of training in restraint. Her breathing came faster. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its mechanical rhythm, and for maybe 90 seconds, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen allowed herself to shake. But when she emerged, her face was calm again. The night nurses started a betting pool by Thursday evening. Not whether she'd quit, by then, it seemed impossible that she would. But when? When would Whitfield's campaign finally break her? When would she stop showing up? The consensus was Monday. Someone bet Tuesday. Nobody bet past the following Friday. They didn't understand that Sarah had already survived worse. Friday night came with the weight of a deadline, the entire week compressed into 48 hours of escalating tension. The ER hummed with its typical Friday chaos, drunk drivers, migraines, one man who'd convinced himself he was having a cardiac event but was actually dehydrated. Sarah moved through it all with the same mechanical precision she'd applied to every insult, every dropped tray, every scattered chart. She was restocking the crash cart at 11:56 p.m. when the ambulance radio crackled to life. St. Michael's receiving, this is Unit 47. We're inbound with a GSW to the chest, male, approximately 52 years old, found unresponsive at a construction site, ETA for minutes. Sarah continued her work. Defibrillator pads in the slot marked for them. Epinephrine in the 4-drawer, dosage labeled clearly. Everything was where it should be. Everything was ordered. Everything was controlled. Alert trauma, please, the radio dispatcher added. Patient is military ID. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rivera, active duty. Sarah's hand stopped. For exactly 2 seconds, she didn't move. The medication vial she was holding, fentanyl, 100 micrograms per milliliter, remained suspended between her fingers. Her eyes were fixed on the supply cart in front of her, seeing nothing. In her mind, David's letters. The ones that came every 3 weeks without fail, written in his careful handwriting, describing the desert and the heat and the way Lieutenant Colonel Rivera had ordered the entire platoon to sit with Private David Chen for 4 hours after his buddy got shot because nobody should process grief alone. Colonel Rivera says hi, Mom. He takes care of us. The medic's voice came back through the radio. Copy that. ETA for minutes. Sarah placed the vial back in its slot. Her hands were steady again. The paramedics burst through the trauma bay doors at 11:51 p.m. with a stretcher that seemed to carry the weight of something larger than one wounded man. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rivera was seizing slightly, his body rigid against the restraints, his uniform soaked with blood. Sarah could see the source, left chest wall, approximately mid-axillary line, the entry wound dark and small, the kind that was deceptive because the damage happened inside where nobody could see it. Dr. Whitfield arrived 90 seconds later, already barking orders. Get him on the monitor, type and cross, prep for imaging. Someone get me an EKG. The ER exploded into controlled chaos. Monitors were hooked up, leads applied to Rivera's chest, the heart rhythm appearing on the screen as a staccato pattern that wasn't quite right. The ambulance crew transferred him smoothly to the hospital bed while calling out vitals like a chant, blood pressure 90/52 and dropping, heart rate 138, oxygen saturation 91% on the ambulance's oxygen. Sarah started the 4-line, 18-gauge, clean stick, blood drawn for the lab before anyone asked for it. Her hands moved like they weren't connected to her conscious mind. Like they belonged to someone else. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Whitfield reviewed the chest X-ray as soon as it came back. Sarah watched his face as the image loaded, watched the moment he recognized what he was seeing. The bullet had nicked the pericardium, the tissue sac that surrounded Rivera's heart. Blood wasn't just bleeding anymore. It was accumulating inside that space, compressing the heart with every passing second, crushing it like a fist slowly closing. Cardiac tamponade. One of the handful of injuries that killed people in minutes if you didn't treat it. Get Morrison, Whitfield snapped. Page cardiothoracic, now. Dr. Morrison is in surgery, one of the residents said quietly. Another trauma case. He said his at least 40 minutes. Rivera's blood pressure dropped to 70/35. The monitor alarm screamed a steady high-pitched shriek that seemed to vibrate in Sarah's teeth. The heart rhythm was becoming irregular, occasional ectopic beats, the electrical system of Rivera's heart starting to fail because the mechanical compression was overwhelming it. His oxygen saturation dropped to 86%. 82%. 80%. Whitfield ordered fluids wide open and was reaching for the intubation kit when Sarah moved. Not fast. Not dramatic. She positioned the ultrasound probe over Rivera's left chest and pressed gently into the space between his ribs, and there it was on the screen, the pericardial sac distended with fluid, the heart compressed and struggling like an animal in a trap. She'd seen this once before. In a burning Humvee outside Bagram, with 2 Marines trapped in the backseat and incoming fire so close she could feel the rounds thump into the armored plating. One of the Marines had cardiac tamponade, and she'd performed the pericardiocentesis in the back of the vehicle with a 14-gauge needle and a prayer. That Marine had survived. But that was 18 months ago, when she'd been someone else. When she'd had the authority to make those decisions. When her rank meant something. Now she was just Mouse. Just a nurse. Just someone who was supposed to be invisible. Friday night, 11:47 p.m. The trauma bay at St. Michael's hummed with the kind of stillness that came before the storm, fluorescent lights casting everything in that harsh white that made blood look black on the tile. Sarah Chen restocked the crash cart with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, each medication and syringe sliding into its exact slot. Epinephrine. Atropine. Amiodarone. The inventory of resurrection. Her hands moved through the familiar choreography while the rest of the night shift dwindled, 2 residents charting in the corner, a nursing student pretending to look busy near the supply closet, Dr. Whitfield somewhere in his office, probably deleting emails with the kind of focused contempt he usually reserved for staff meetings. The radio on the trauma bay wall crackled to life at 11:52 p.m. Incoming, dispatch said, voice calm as always. Gunshot wound to the anterior chest. Male, approximately 55 years old. Military identification. ETA for minutes. Sarah's hands paused for exactly 1 second on the 4 setup. Military ID. Anterior chest GSW meant potential cardiac involvement, potential tamponade, potential massive hemorrhage into spaces that would compress the heart until it stopped moving altogether. She didn't reach for the radio. She reached for the pericardiocentesis tray, the long cardiac needle, the syringe, the sterile drape, and laid it on the secondary table with the certainty of someone preparing for what she already knew was coming. The doors burst open 3 minutes and 47 seconds later. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher in with that controlled urgency that meant they'd already done the hard part, gotten him out, gotten him breathing, gotten him here. Sarah caught the patient's face in the overhead lights and felt something shift in her chest, a sensation like a fault line cracking beneath perfectly still ground. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rivera. She knew that name from her son David's deployment letters, from the careful sentences he'd written home about his commanding officer, a man with 23 years of service, 2 adopted daughters, a wife who was a pediatric oncologist, a habit of checking on his junior officers' families during rotations. The man who'd written David's last performance evaluation before the extraction went sideways in Bagram. The man whose commanding officer had signed the casualty reports that got buried. Vitals? Dr. Whitfield emerged from somewhere in the hallway, already pulling on fresh gloves with the irritated snap of someone interrupted mid-thought. BP 84/56 and dropping, the paramedic said, moving alongside the stretcher. Pulse 120. Rest 28. We got 2 large bores running wide open. He coded in the ambulance, PEA, we pushed 1 round of epi, got a rhythm back for about 2 minutes, then flatlined again. We've been bagging him since. Pulseless electrical activity. The monitor would show electrical activity, lines and spikes that looked like organized heart rhythm, but the heart itself wouldn't be squeezing, wouldn't be pumping blood anywhere. Sarah had learned the difference between a heart that looked like it was working and a heart that actually worked during her first deployment, when a Marine took shrapnel and the monitor showed perfect sinus rhythm while his blood pressure read 0 on the cuff. Perfect rhythm. Dead patient. They transferred him to the trauma bay bed in the synchronized motion of practiced people, and Sarah positioned herself at his left side with the pericardiocentesis tray already in her hands. The monitor showed exactly what she'd expected, electrical activity. Organized complexes. Completely useless without perfusion. The full lines ran wide open, blood already going in faster than his damaged body could use it, pooling somewhere in the chest cavity, compressing the heart, squeezing it like a fist tightening around an organ the size of a closed fist. Chest X-ray, Whitfield commanded, and Sarah moved, not to fetch the portable, but to prepare. Widened mediastinum, she said quietly, reading the anatomy of the penetrating trauma. Anterior GSW meant the bullet had traversed the central chest, and whatever path it had taken, it had hit something vascular. Hit something that was now filling the space where Rivera's heart was supposed to have room to function. I'm aware of what anterior means, Chen, Whitfield said, and there was that tone again, the edge he reserved for her specifically, the particular flavor of contempt that made the other residents stare at their monitors a little harder, made them suddenly very interested in their own patients. Morrison is coming down from surgery. We'll get him to the OR, crack the sternum, find the bleed, repair it. The monitor displayed another rhythm for 3 seconds. Then flatlined. Not the sudden violent flatline of a massive MI. The slow fade of a system running out of resources, a heart too compressed to keep trying. Sarah watched the T-wave flatten into a line, watched the electrical activity disappear, and did the math in her head with the same precision she'd once used to calculate blast radiuses and casualty estimates. Morrison, the cardiothoracic surgeon, was on the 2nd floor. Elevator ride down, 90 seconds minimum. Sterile field prep, 5 minutes. Actual opening of the chest, another 2 minutes. That meant Rivera would be without effective circulation for at minimum 600 seconds. Brain damage started at 4 minutes of anoxia. Critical at 6. Rivera would be a vegetable or dead by the time Morrison's scalpel touched skin. Start compressions, Whitfield said, and a resident moved immediately, positioning himself at the chest to begin the mechanical up and down that looked like it was helping because it created the appearance of action. But compressions didn't fix cardiac tamponade. Compressions were for the heart that had rhythm problems, not for the heart that was literally being crushed by fluid and blood in the space surrounding it. Sarah set down the pericardiocentesis tray on the bedside table and stepped closer. Her voice came out steady and flat, the voice she used when reading medication names aloud before administration. Dr. Whitfield. He needs immediate pericardiocentesis. Whitfield looked up, and she watched his face shift through something, first confusion, then a flash of anger that made his jaw clench the same way hers did when she was restraining herself. I'll decide what he needs, mouse. The surgeon is 3 minutes out. Keep compressions going. 3 minutes. Sarah glanced at the clock, the big red one mounted on the trauma bay wall that ticked seconds away in the background of every crisis. Rivera would be legally brain dead in approximately 480 seconds if something didn't change the trajectory of his blood pressure and his oxygenation and his perfusion status. She'd performed pericardiocentesis 47 times in her actual career, in conditions where the decision to act or not act meant the difference between coming home and getting shipped home in a flag-folded box. She'd done it during sandstorms and under fire and with less equipment and more pressure than this controlled, well-lit trauma bay represented. She'd also spent the last 3 months being called just a nurse by a man who saw patients as problems to be solved and staff as obstacles to be moved around his solutions. Whitfield moved toward the crash cart, positioning himself to physically block the space where she was standing, his body language making the choice explicit. Do not intervene. Do not challenge. Accept this hierarchy and watch the patient die or break protocol and face consequences. Sarah moved around him in one smooth motion, not pushing past, not confrontational, just present in the space she needed to be in. Her left hand palpated Rivera's chest landmarks, feeling the familiar architecture of bone and cartilage. Xiphoid process. 5th intercostal space. The subxiphoid approach, denta at a 45-degree angle, just below and slightly to the left of the xiphoid, advance until you hit the pericardium, then aspirate. She'd done this while helicopters landed beside her. She'd done this with a concussion. She'd done this while other people were dying around her, and this particular person was the one whose life could actually be salvaged. What the hell are you doing? Whitfield's voice climbed half an octave. Sarah had already inserted the long cardiac needle. The angle was perfect. The depth was right. Her hands didn't shake and her breathing didn't change, and she didn't feel the pressure of every person in the trauma bay staring at her like she'd just walked into a patient's room naked. She aspirated. Dark blood filled the syringe immediately, blood that had been crushing Rivera's heart, blood that had been compressing the electrical activity into uselessness, blood that had been slowly suffocating the one organ that could keep a human being alive. 40 milliliters. 50. She withdrew the needle and applied pressure with a gauze pad, her movements continuing in the same steady flow, no hesitation, no doubt, just the mechanics of a procedure she could perform in her sleep. The monitor chirped. Once. Twice. Then it displayed a rhythm, not the perfect, useless rhythm of PEA, but actual organized complexes, actual electrical activity that meant something because now the heart had the space it needed to contract. Rivera's chest rose with the bag valve mask. His oxygen saturation climbed from 43% to 72 to 88. His blood pressure, read through the automated cuff, changed from undetectable to 72 systolic. Blood pressure coming up, the resident said, disbelief clear in every word. The trauma bay filled with the sound of machines recalibrating, monitors finding actual parameters worth displaying, the return of normal physiology. Sarah stepped back and discarded the needle into the sharps container with the same casual precision with which she'd used it, and that's when she felt Whitfield's presence beside her, close enough that she could smell the remnants of his cologne, the particular brand that probably cost more than her entire paycheck. "My office," he said quietly, and the quiet was worse than any yelling would have been. "Now." She turned to look at him, and his eyes had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the crisis they'd just managed. She'd seen that look before, in the face of a junior officer whose superior had been shown up in front of troops and was calculating exactly how much institutional power could be weaponized in response. It was the look of a man who'd just realized that the small, quiet person he'd been humiliating was capable of things he hadn't imagined, and rather than being impressed or grateful, he was furious. Sarah didn't move. "Rivera needs post-resuscitation care. Continuous monitoring. He should be going to surgery as soon as possible." "I'm aware, Chen." "My office." 5 minutes. He walked away, and the trauma bay resumed its coordinated movement, the surgical team arriving, the transport preparations, the documentation of what had happened in the last 42 seconds. Sarah stood at the bedside and looked at Rivera's face, at the steady rhythm on the monitor that meant his heart was pumping blood again, meant he might actually survive this, meant her son's commanding officer had a chance to come home to his daughters and his wife and his life. The doors to Whitfield's office closed with a soft click. Sarah stood perfectly still, her scrub still damp from Rivera's blood, her hands hanging at her sides. Whitfield moved behind his desk with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. He sat down slowly, deliberately, creating distance and hierarchy in a single gesture. "You performed a surgical procedure," he said, his voice flat and measured. "Without physician supervision. Without credentialing. Without authorization." Sarah's jaw tightened, barely visible, a muscle tensing beneath her skin. The patient was in cardiac arrest from tamponade. The surgeon was 40 minutes away. "I don't care if he was dying in the parking lot." Whitfield leaned back in his chair, and something cold moved behind his eyes. "You're a nurse. Not a surgeon. Not a physician. A nurse." He drew the word out like an insult, each syllable a small blade. "I'm documenting this as an unauthorized procedure with credentialing concerns. And I'm copying the board." Sarah's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. But something in her face, the way her eyes went flat and distant, suggested she understood exactly what had just been set in motion. A predator recognizing that another predator had entered the room. She turned and walked out without speaking. By Monday morning, Whitfield had already made his first call. His voice on the phone to Dr. Harrison, the hospital board chairman, was smooth as engine oil of "Marcus, I need to talk to you about a credentialing situation. One of our nurses performed what amounts to emergency cardiac surgery without proper authorization. It's a liability nightmare, frankly." He let that hang there. "She claims clinical judgment. I call it cowboy medicine." The second call came at 10:44 a.m. to Dr. Linda Park, another board member. Same story, slightly different wording. Dangerous behavioral pattern. Someone who doesn't respect the chain of command. In a trauma setting, that gets people killed. The third call went to Dr. Raymond Chen, no relation to Sarah, at 2:15 p.m. "I'm not one to make accusations lightly, but I have serious concerns about her background. Her credentials before she arrived at St. Michael's 3 months ago are almost non-existent. It's like she didn't exist before 2023. By Tuesday morning, Whitfield had filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Board of Nursing, requesting an immediate investigation into unauthorized medical procedures performed by nursing staff without appropriate physician supervision and credentialing verification. The language was precise, the implications devastating. But the call that truly mattered came at 4:33 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. Whitfield sat in his office with the door locked, his voice lowered even though no one could hear him. "It's Whitfield at St. Michael's in Atlanta. I need to ask you about someone." A pause. "Sarah Chen. Nurse, transferred here 3 months ago. No employment history prior to 2023. No references that go back more than 4 years. And today she performed what looks like a surgical procedure on a trauma patient." Another pause, longer this time. "I know. That's what I thought too. I'm just wondering if maybe her background is worth looking into. Maybe she's not exactly who she says she is." The contact at Homeland Security made a note. Wednesday morning came cold and grey. The hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Reeves with steel-grey hair and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been in healthcare administration for 30 years, called Sarah into her office at 7:48 a.m. "I'm sorry," Reeves said, and she actually meant it. "Your suspension is effective immediately, pending a full investigation by the Board of Nursing and our credentialing committee. You can appeal, but until this is cleared up, you're not authorized to work." Sarah had nodded once, her face a blank wall. How long? Could be weeks. Could be months. Reeves looked away. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know what you did saved that patient. But the procedure," she left the sentence unfinished. By 8:17 a.m., security escorted Sarah to her locker. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, removing her personal items, a spare stethoscope, a photograph of her and David from 3 years ago when he'd gotten his Navy commission, a water bottle with the Navy SEAL trident on it. And the challenge coin. The tarnished military challenge coin she'd kept in the bottom of her locker since she arrived at St. Michael's, the one proof of who she'd been before the erasure, before the new identity, before Atlanta. She held it in her palm for exactly 3 seconds. Then she slipped it into her scrub pocket. From his office window on the 2nd floor, Whitfield watched her walk out through the ambulance bay, her head level, her stride steady, her face betraying nothing. He smiled. He'd eliminated the problem. The poor performance review would come next, and within a month, the board would quietly close her file, and she'd disappear into whatever life erased nurses lived. 2 weeks' salary won. Done. He never looked at his phone to see if anyone from Homeland Security had called back. The kitchen table at Sarah's apartment was old oak, scarred from years of use. David had done his homework on this table as a kid. Sarah had sat here to read letters from him during his deployment. Now she sat at this same table at 6:04 p.m. on Wednesday evening, hours before her shift should have ended, staring at the tarnished coin in her open palm. The coin was 2 inches across, bronze gone dark with age, one side stamped with the crossed pistols and trident of naval special warfare, the other side smooth and blank. It weighed almost nothing. It meant everything. It was the only physical proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had existed at all, that she'd been real, that the 16 people she couldn't name had actually existed, that Bagram had been real and not some classified nightmare someone else had lived. Tears slid down her cheeks silently, with no sound and no shaking, just water streaming from her eyes like rain running down a window. She'd held her composure through every insult Whitfield had delivered. She'd kept her face neutral through every humiliation. She'd performed a surgical procedure under fire, metaphorically speaking, and saved a man's life. But she couldn't hold this. The door opened. David stood in the doorway, still in his Navy working uniform, his sea bag over his shoulder, his face confused and alarmed. "Mom? Why are you home?" Sarah's hand closed around the coin. She couldn't answer. "Mom." He set his bag down, moving toward her with the careful steps of someone approaching something fragile. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I got suspended," Sarah said, her voice hollow and thin as paper. "Pending investigation." David sat across from her, his young face creasing with concern. "For what? What did you do?" Sarah looked at the coin in her closed fist. How could she explain? How could she tell him that she'd saved a patient, that the patient had been his commanding officer, that in saving Marcus Rivera she'd exposed herself to someone who'd weaponized her classified past? How could she say the words "I couldn't let him die" without saying "he's your commander," without saying all the things she'd promised the Navy she would never say? "It's complicated," she whispered. "Mom, look at me." David reached across the table. "Whatever happened, we'll figure it out." Sarah opened her fist. The coin gleamed dully under the kitchen light. "What is that?" David asked. "Nothing," Sarah said. "It's nothing." But they both knew it was everything. David reached for the coin, but Sarah closed her hand again, pulling it back against her chest like a child protecting a secret. In the gathering darkness of her kitchen, Sarah Chen, nurse, classified operative, woman with no official past, sat with her son and held the only proof that she'd ever been anyone at all. Outside, rain had begun to fall against the windows, soft and persistent, and inside, the silence held the weight of secrets that could destroy lives if they ever came into the light. For nights later, at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday, a massive armed man stormed through the sliding glass doors of St. Michael's Trauma Bay screaming in Pashto, blood pouring from a construction accident that had nearly severed his forearm, waving a length of twisted rebar like a weapon while terrified staff scattered in every direction. The man was easily 6'4", built like a military vehicle, his shirt soaked red, his eyes wild with pain and panic and something else, something that looked like recognition. Nurses bolted toward the back exits. An orderly dropped a stack of charts and ran. The security guard at the desk reached for his radio with shaking hands, calling for backup that was for minutes out, maybe 5, maybe too late. Sarah Chen heard the screaming from the med supply closet where she was restocking trauma kits. She heard the doors burst open like gunfire. She heard the scatter of feet, the dropped equipment, the sound of controlled chaos collapsing into actual chaos. She didn't hesitate. She walked directly toward him. The man was holding the rebar like a club, his breathing ragged and shallow, his left arm hanging useless with arterial spray still pumping despite the pressure he was attempting to apply with his right hand. His eyes were rolling, unfocused, then landing on her as she approached with her hands visible and empty. She began speaking in Pashto, her voice dropping into a register that carried the weight of command, not the tentative tone of a night shift nurse, but the voice of someone who had given orders in combat zones and expected obedience. "You're safe now," she said in his language. "Lower the rebar. Let me see your arm." The man's pupils contracted. He stared at her as though she'd materialized from a hallucination. His breathing shifted from panic to something controlled, something that recognized authority even in his trauma state. She kept speaking, kept moving closer, her hand still visible, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Zarsanga," he whispered. The code name. The call sign that hadn't been spoken in 2 years, that belonged to a woman the Navy had officially erased from existence. The rebar dropped to the tile floor with a sound like a ship's anchor hitting concrete. Sarah caught him as he collapsed, her hands already reaching for arterial pressure points, her mind cataloguing the wound, partial amputation of the distal forearm, significant blood loss, but the radial and ulnar vessels were still intact if she could get him to the OR in the next 8 minutes. She lowered him to the floor and was calling for a level 1 trauma alert before anyone else had caught up to what had just happened. "Tourniquet, now," she said to the nurse who'd finally emerged from the supply room, her voice cutting through the white noise of shock. "Pressure dressing. 2 units O negative. Get me a surgeon in the OR." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The security guard who'd reached for his radio was standing frozen near the doors, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd seen serious things. He was staring at Sarah with the specific kind of recognition that came from military training, from understanding the difference between a civilian and a warrior. He said slowly. Are you Master Chief Petty Officer?" That was when General Marcus Hastings emerged from the ICU where he'd been visiting Colonel Rivera. He was a man built like old oak, stars on his shoulder and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He took in the scene in a single sweep, Sarah on the floor with a tourniquet in place, the Pashto-speaking patient's eyes fixed on her face with something between terror and gratitude, the evacuated trauma bay now filling with staff who'd realized the immediate threat was contained. "What happened?" Hastings said, not a question. Sarah didn't look up from the dressing she was applying. "Partial amputation. Arterial bleeding controlled. Ready for OR." Hastings pulled out his phone and made a call. 30 seconds of listening, then he disconnected and opened his email. His fingers moved across the screen, accessing something, pulling something, his jaw tightening as he read. When he looked up, his eyes had gone the color of a winter Atlantic. "Security," he said quietly. "Stand by that door. No one leaves." Then, in a voice that filled the entire trauma bay despite his calm tone, General Hastings began to read. "Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy Special Operations Command. 23 years of active service. 37 confirmed combat deployments. Bronze Star for Valor in the Cuna Province, 2014. He paused. A single beat while the staff understood they were in the presence of something much larger than themselves. Silver Star for actions under fire during the Arghandab Valley Operation, 2015. Another pause. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, indifferent to revelations that were reshaping every assumption in the room. Second Silver Star for direct action in Helm and Province, 2016. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. The words hung in the air like defibrillator paddles, shocking, absolute, final. Sarah's hands didn't stop moving. The tourniquet was secure. The bleeding was controlled. The patient was stable enough for transport. She continued her work as though the general wasn't rebuilding her entire existence from classified files and redacted records. Colonel Rivera, rolling his wheelchair out from the ICU bay where he'd been observing, completed the testimony himself. "She pulled 4 of us out of a burning vehicle in Bagram," he said, his voice the raw sound of someone speaking truth against impossible odds. "Took effective fire from 2 positions. Carried me 50 meters across open ground while wearing 60 pounds of body armor and someone else's blood. I wouldn't be here watching my daughter graduate next month if Master Chief Chen hadn't decided to save my life instead of save her own." He stopped his wheelchair 3 feet away and simply looked at her. "Thank you, Master Chief." The words landed like a handshake between warriors. Dr. Whitfield emerged from his office then, his face carefully composed in a mask of professional concern, but his eyes had gone the color of dead things. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "General Hastings, I wasn't aware we had a decorated veteran on staff," he began, his voice oily with false respect, his brain already calculating angles and damage control. "Had I known Master Chief Chen's background?" "You knew she saved Colonel Rivera," the general interrupted. His voice was polite. Absolutely cordial. "Also a guillotine blade. And you had her fired for it." The lobby was filling with people now, off-duty nurses arriving after seeing alerts, reporters getting wind of the armed standoff in a downtown hospital, orderlies and residents and physicians who'd all dropped what they were doing to witness something extraordinary. Someone had filmed the moment Sarah spoke Pashto and the patient's recognition. Someone had captured the general's recitation of her medals. By Wednesday morning, that video had 30,000 shares and climbing, paired with another video that had suddenly resurfaced, security footage from St. Michael's cafeteria from 3 weeks prior, showing Dr. Whitfield tripping Sarah, her tray crashing to the floor, his smirk visible and unmistakable. A nursing student had uploaded it then and it had vanished into nothing. Now it was everywhere. Local news channels ran the comparison in split screen, a Master Chief Petty Officer being casually humiliated by a doctor who didn't know he was bullying someone who'd earned a Navy Cross. By Thursday afternoon, Dr. Richard Castellano, a decorated Army surgeon who'd been Whitfield's mentor in medical school 20 years ago, had seen the videos. Castellano released a public statement through his hospital's communications office. "I am appalled and ashamed to have trained Dr. Whitfield. His behavior contradicts every value I attempted to instill in my students. I disavow his actions entirely and withdraw any professional association or endorsement I may have previously provided. The hospital's legal team reviewed Whitfield's formal complaints against Sarah, the unauthorized procedure claims, the credentialing concerns, the Homeland Security inquiry, and discovered that his contact at the agency had been inappropriate, that he'd used hospital resources to investigate an employee for personal retaliation, that he'd violated her privacy and potentially committed crimes in the process. Friday morning at 7 a.m., Whitfield was called to a board meeting in the executive conference room. He arrived confident, prepared to defend his clinical decisions and his personal prerogatives, but the board chair slid a termination letter across the mahogany table without preamble. For cause, she said, her voice the temperature of absolute authority. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Whitfield's face went white. You're firing me? For enforcing standards? For maintaining medical hierarchy? The board chair turned on the large screen mounted above the conference table and played the cafeteria video in silence. 30 seconds of him tripping Sarah, her tray scattering, his smirk. 30 seconds of documented cruelty. We're firing you for creating a hostile work environment and abusing your authority, the board chair said. Master Chief Chen's credentials were impeccable. Your investigation was harassment. You're done. 2 security officers escorted him out the same glass door that Sarah had been forced through a week earlier, his office packed into 2 cardboard boxes, his staff privileges revoked, his medical license suspended pending review by the state board. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the trauma bay wearing scrubs embroidered with training director on the pocket. The board had reinstated her with a formal apology and then promoted her to run St. Michael's new trauma training program, teaching emergency procedures to nurses and residents who'd never seen the kind of precision she carried in her hands. Colonel Rivera visited with his daughter before her graduation, wheelchair-free now, moving with the careful gait of someone still healing. He shook Sarah's hand in the hallway and didn't let go. My family owes you everything, he told her. David, on leave from his deployment, finally understood why his mother had hidden. She'd told him everything, Bagram, the 16 casualties buried in classified files, the erasure, the years of carrying weight in silence. Sometimes Sarah heard through the nursing network that Whitfield had found work teaching basic CPR certification courses at an Atlanta community college for $18 an hour. No hospitals would hire him after the video and Castellano's disavowal. She imagined him demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his career reduced to the simplest skill, and she felt the specific kind of nothing that comes from knowing consequences eventually find everyone. In the supply room before her shift, Sarah held the tarnished challenge coin, running her thumb over the worn insignia. 16 names were engraved on the back, so small you needed good light to read them. She'd carried their weight in silence, had let herself be erased to protect the mission, had accepted invisibility as penance. But Hamid's desperate arrival and panicked recognition had forced the truth into the light, and somehow, impossibly, she'd survived exposure. She pinned the coin inside her locker where she could see it daily, no longer hidden in her purse. As she walked to the trauma bay for training rounds, Sarah passed a new nurse, young, quiet, standing apart from the others, her hand steady and her eyes watchful. Sarah recognized that posture, that careful invisibility. She stopped. You're going to do fine here, Sarah said quietly. The young nurse looked up, surprised. How do you know? Sarah almost smiled. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. She continued to her rounds, the fluorescent lights bright overhead, the antiseptic smell familiar as breathing, finally visible in the place she'd tried so hard to disappear. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to see more stories about the quiet warriors among us. Like this video if it resonated with you. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?